A new police chief walked into the precinct undercover, her presence unnoticed amidst the morning chaos. Dressed in a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, Angela Monroe looked nothing like the leader who would soon shake the department to its core. That was intentional. She wasn't here for introductions. She was here to uncover the truth. The parking lot buzzed with casual chatter as officers leaned against squad cars, exchanging jokes and stories. Angela's sharp eyes scanned the scene. No one gave her a second glance as she slipped inside through a side entrance. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of ringing phones. Conversations overlapped, filling the space with a steady din of noise. She walked with purpose, her gaze quietly assessing every corner of the precinct. Just then, a sharp voice sliced through the chatter. "Hey, you!" Angela turned, locking eyes with a tall, broad-shouldered officer striding toward her. His badge read Daniels, and the smug grin on his face radiated arrogance. Behind him, a group of officers leaned against the wall, watching with thinly veiled amusement. "You lost or something?" Daniel sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Angela's expression remained neutral, her heart steady despite the rising tension. "I was just—" she began, but Daniels interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here!" Daniel's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby officers. "We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the group behind him. One officer slapped a desk, doubling over in amusement. Angela clenched her jaw, her composure unshaken, as Daniel stepped closer. His face was inches from hers now, his breath heavy with the scent of coffee. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice low and mocking. "Cat got your tongue?" And then it happened. Without warning, Daniel spat directly into her face. Time seemed to freeze. The warm saliva dripped down Angela's cheek, her breath catching in her throat. The room erupted in laughter, the cruel sound bouncing off the walls. Daniel smirked, his arms crossing over his chest as if he had won some unspoken battle. But Angela didn't flinch. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Her movements were deliberate, her expression calm as she wiped her face. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" she asked, her voice steady and cutting. "Only the ones who don't belong," Daniels replied, his grin widening as the officers behind him chuckled. Angela's gaze swept over the group, her dark eyes piercing. The laughter faltered as some officers avoided her stare. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps firm and deliberate. Behind her, the laughter faded to a nervous hush. Daniels leaned back against the wall, his smirk fading as he watched her disappear down the hallway. He had no idea who she was, or what was coming next. Angela, however, knew exactly what lay ahead. Every step she took carried the weight of her mission. She wasn't here to be dismissed or disrespected. She was here to change everything. The briefing room buzzed with activity, officers filing in with coffee cups in hand and laughter echoing through the space. The energy was casual, almost careless, as if it were just another routine day. Angela Monroe stood behind a side door, her sharp gaze fixed on the crowd. In her hands, she held a leather folder embossed with the precinct's official seal. Every detail about this moment had been carefully planned. Daniels lounged in the back of the room, his smug grin still firmly in place after the morning's incident. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he entertained a group of officers with exaggerated retellings of his run-in with the stranger. The group laughed, their amusement feeding Daniel's growing arrogance. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a stout man with a commanding presence, stepped up to the podium. He clapped his hands to quiet the room, his voice cutting through the noise. "All right, settle down," he barked. The officers gradually turned their attention to him, though a few continued to whisper among themselves. "We've got an important introduction today," Harris began, his tone serious. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Since then, we've been waiting for his replacement. Today's the day you'll meet the new chief of police." A murmur spread through the room as officers exchanged curious glances. Daniels, however, barely reacted. He leaned back further, his smirk widening as if nothing could shake his confidence. Angela stepped forward from the side door, her movements deliberate and controlled. The officers fell silent as she approached the podium, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoing in the suddenly quiet room. She placed her folder down, her hands steady as she looked up and scanned the crowd. "My name is Angela Monroe," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." The air shifted instantly. Daniel's smirk vanished, his face blanching as her words sank in. Around him, officers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers breaking out among the group. Angela let the moment linger, her calm gaze sweeping over the room. The weight of her presence and her words hung heavy in the air. "When I arrived this morning," Angela continued, her tone sharp, "I came in plain clothes. I wanted to see this department for what it truly is. Not the version you prepare for introductions, but the reality of how it operates day to day." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his confidence cracking under her steady gaze. Angela's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before addressing the room as a whole. "What I witnessed was eye-opening," she said, her voice deliberate. "Behaviors that were not just unprofessional, but unacceptable. That ends today." Murmurs rippled through the room, but Angela raised her hand, silencing them immediately. "Respect is not optional," she said firmly. "It is the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." Angela stepped away from the podium, her footsteps slow and purposeful as she moved closer to the rows of seated officers. Her gaze locked onto Daniels, who was now visibly sweating. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone icy, "your actions this morning were not just disrespectful, they were disgraceful. You didn't just humiliate me, you humiliated the badge, the oath we took, and the community we are sworn to protect." Daniel stammered, his voice barely audible. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's the problem," Angela cut in sharply. "You didn't think. You didn't care. And that lack of care is why this department has lost the trust of the people we serve." Angela turned back to the rest of the room, her voice rising slightly as she addressed them. "This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a culture that tolerates and even celebrates behaviors that have no place in law enforcement. If you think that culture can continue, let me assure you, it will not." Returning to the podium, Angela stood tall, her voice steady but commanding. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. This decision is final, and it sends a clear message. Misconduct will not be tolerated." Gasps spread through the room. Daniel sat frozen, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. The other officers avoided his gaze, their expressions ranging from shock to unease. Angela let her final words hang in the air. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about setting a standard. If you're ready to rise to that standard, I will stand with you. But if you're not, this is not the place for you." She stepped away from the podium, her gaze sweeping over the room one last time. The silence was deafening as the weight of her words settled over the officers. Daniel shifted in his seat, his bravado completely gone. Angela turned and exited through the side door, leaving the officers to sit in stunned silence. Every step she took was deliberate, her mission clearer than ever. This was only the beginning. Angela Monroe stood at the podium, her commanding presence silencing the room. The tension was palpable, every officer on edge as her words from earlier hung in the air. She scanned their faces, her sharp gaze landing on each one, ensuring they felt the weight of this moment. "What I witnessed this morning was not an isolated incident," Angela began, her voice steady but firm. "It was a symptom of a toxic culture that has been allowed to fester in this precinct for far too long." A murmur rippled through the room, but Angela raised her hand, cutting it off immediately. "Let me be clear. That culture ends today. From this moment forward, we hold ourselves to the highest standards of respect, integrity, and accountability. Anything less will not be tolerated." Her words were deliberate, each one striking with precision. Angela stepped away from the podium, walking slowly toward the front row of officers. Her movements were measured, her presence undeniable. "Respect is not optional," she continued. "It's the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the very people we swore to serve." Angela's eyes landed on Daniels, who sat stiffly near the back. his face flushed with humiliation. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Your actions this morning weren't just disrespectful, they were disgraceful. You spat in my face without a second thought, without an ounce of decency." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth as if to speak, but Angela silenced him with a sharp look. "You didn't stop to think. You didn't care to know who I was or why I was here. And that lack of care is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the community it serves." Her gaze shifted back to the rest of the room. "This isn't just about one officer's actions," Angela said, her voice rising slightly. "It's about a culture that has tolerated and, in some cases, celebrated behaviors that have no place in law enforcement. If you think that culture can continue, let me assure you, it will not." Angela returned to the podium, her posture straight and commanding. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. This is not a suggestion, it is a decision, and it sends a clear message. Misconduct will not be ignored or excused." Gasps rippled through the room, and Daniels' face turned an even deeper shade of red. He stared at the floor, avoiding the glances of his peers. Angela's eyes scanned the room again, her tone softening slightly. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about creating a culture where every officer can take pride in the badge they wear. If you can't meet that standard, this is not the place for you." Angela leaned slightly forward, her voice low but resolute. "But for those of you who are ready to rise to that standard, I will stand with you every step of the way. Together, we will rebuild this precinct into something we can all be proud of." The officers sat in silence, the weight of Angela's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Daniels remained frozen, his hands still gripping the edge of his chair. Around him, other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of guilt and uncertainty. Angela stepped away from the podium, her footsteps deliberate as she moved toward the exit. At the door, she paused and turned back to face the room. "Change is never easy," she said, her tone softer now but no less commanding. "But it is necessary, and it starts today." With that, Angela walked out of the room, her presence still lingering long after she was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, a powerful reminder that the status quo was no longer an option. Daniel sat motionless, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. Angela walked down the hallway, her mind focused on the battles yet to come. This moment was just the beginning, a single step in the long journey of transforming a broken system. But for Angela, it was enough. Change wasn't just possible, it had already begun. The fallout from Angela Monroe's announcement rippled through the precinct. Officer Daniels' suspension had sent shockwaves through the department, dividing officers into those who supported her vision and those who resented the change. The tension in the air was palpable, and whispers followed Angela wherever she went. She wasn't deterred. This was what she had expected when she took the job. Daniels wasn't going quietly. Within days, he filed an appeal, claiming his suspension was unjust and accusing Angela of using him as a scapegoat. His appeal sparked quiet conversations in the break room and murmurs in the hallways. A small but vocal group of officers began to openly question Angela's leadership, whispering about whether she was too harsh. Some saw Daniels as a victim, while others remained silent, waiting to see how things unfolded. Angela, however, was focused. She spent long hours in her office, poring over Daniels' history. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. His file was thick with complaints, ranging from excessive force to inappropriate comments. It was a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for years. Angela's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Daniels. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed such behavior to thrive. She called a meeting to address the growing unrest head-on. Standing at the front of the room, Angela looked out at the sea of faces, noting the unease in some and the quiet defiance in others. "I know some of you are uncomfortable with what's happening," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "Change is never easy, especially when it forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. But this isn't about comfort. It's about doing what's right." Her words cut through the room, silencing even the quiet murmurs. When we wear this badge, we make a promise to serve with integrity, to hold ourselves accountable, and to protect this community. If we can't meet those promises, we have no business wearing this uniform. Angela's gaze swept the room, pausing on Officer Reyes, a young recruit seated near the front. Reyes shifted uncomfortably before raising her hand. "Chief, can I say something?" she asked hesitantly. Angela nodded. "Go ahead." Reyes stood, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "I laughed at Daniel's jokes. I didn't stop him when I knew I should have. I let things slide because I was afraid to speak up. But I don't want to be that kind of officer anymore." The room shifted as whispers spread among the officers. Angela walked closer to Reyes, her expression softening. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step," Angela said, her voice kind but firm. "The next step is proving that you're willing to change. Show your colleagues that you're serious." Reyes nodded, her determination clear. Angela turned back to the group, her tone sharpening once again. "This isn't about punishing one officer," she said. "It's about creating a culture where we can take pride in the badge we wear. That starts with holding ourselves and each other accountable." Despite her words, resistance lingered. Flyers criticizing Angela's leadership appeared anonymously on bulletin boards, calling her methods divisive and harsh. Angela read the flyers but didn't react. Change was never easy, and she knew the pushback was inevitable. Instead, she focused on her work, rolling out workshops on implicit bias, de-escalation, and community engagement. The sessions were mandatory, and while some officers attended reluctantly, others, like Reyes, embraced the opportunity to grow. The turning point came during another department-wide meeting. Daniel's appeal had gained little traction after Angela's investigation revealed the extent of his misconduct. Standing at the podium, Angela addressed the room with her characteristic resolve. "This isn't about one person," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every officer in this department is someone the community can trust. If we can't meet that standard, we don't deserve to wear this badge." Her words landed with finality, silencing even the quietest whispers. Daniel, sitting in the back, clenched his jaw but said nothing. Angela's voice softened slightly as she added, "If you're willing to rise to the challenge, I will stand with you. But if you're not, this isn't the place for you." As the meeting ended, officers filed out in silence. Some approached Angela afterward, offering quiet words of support. Others avoided her gaze, their resistance still evident. But Angela wasn't discouraged. The divide was shrinking, and she could see the early signs of a cultural shift. Small changes began to take root. Officers who once ignored misconduct started speaking up. Laughter in the precinct halls no longer carried the sharp edge of cruelty. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but its grip was loosening. And for Angela, that was enough to keep going. Angela Monroe's relentless presence in the precinct was impossible to ignore. Every morning she walked the halls, greeting officers by name and observing interactions. Her calm but commanding demeanor served as a daily reminder of the new standards she had set. Over time, the resistance she faced began to waver, and subtle shifts in the precinct's culture started to emerge. One morning, Officer Reyes approached Angela with hesitant steps. Her face was flushed, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Chief," she began, her voice quiet, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Angela stopped, her expression softening. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Reyes glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "I need to admit something," she said, her voice trembling. "When Daniels made those comments to you, I laughed. I didn't say anything. I didn't stop him. And I've been part of the problem in other ways too. But I want to change." Angela studied Reyes for a moment, her sharp gaze softening further. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step," Angela said gently. "The next step is action. Prove to your colleagues and yourself that you're ready to do better." Reyes nodded, her expression firming with determination. "I won't let you down, Chief." This moment, though small, was significant. It represented the cracks forming in the toxic culture Angela had walked into. Some officers, like Reyes, were beginning to reflect on their actions and make conscious efforts to change. Others remained cautious, unsure of how to navigate the shifting dynamics. Angela's decision to implement mandatory workshops on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement was met with mixed reactions. While some officers grumbled about the changes, others embraced them as opportunities for growth. During one workshop, Angela addressed the group directly. "This isn't about checking a box," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about becoming better officers. If we're not willing to confront our own biases, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Reyes raised her hand. "Chief, I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "But these workshops have made me realize how much I can improve. I'm ready to change." Angela smiled faintly. "That's all I ask," she replied. "Change isn't easy, but it starts with moments like this." Meanwhile, Daniel's suspension continued to cast a long shadow. Some officers still whispered in his defense, though their voices were quieter now. The findings from Angela's investigation had painted a clear picture of his repeated misconduct, and many officers were beginning to distance themselves from him. The community also began to take notice. Complaints against the precinct dropped significantly, and Angela made a point of attending neighborhood meetings to rebuild trust. Residents who had once viewed the department with skepticism started to show cautious optimism. One evening, a young mother approached Angela after a meeting. "Chief Monroe," she began hesitantly, "I didn't trust the police before. But I see what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it. It's not perfect, but it's something." Angela nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you," she said. "We're working hard to get it right, and we won't stop until we do." Back at the precinct, the changes became more visible. Laughter still echoed through the halls, but it was no longer sharp or cruel. It was genuine, a sign of camaraderie rather than exclusion. Officers began collaborating more, sharing responsibilities and treating one another with a newfound respect. Angela remained vigilant, knowing the work was far from finished. Not everyone was ready to embrace the changes, and a small faction of officers continued to resist quietly. Flyers criticizing her leadership still appeared from time to time, though they were fewer and far between. Angela didn't let them bother her. "Change takes time," she reminded her leadership team during a meeting, "but every small step forward matters. It's not about perfection, it's about progress." By the end of the day, Angela stood in the main hallway, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The department wasn't perfect, but it was undeniably different. A culture of accountability was beginning to take root, and the laughter that once masked toxicity now signaled genuine connection. Angela allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it, and she wasn't about to stop now. Angela Monroe stood at the edge of a bustling community event, the warm buzz of chatter and laughter filling the air. Families moved between brightly colored booths, children clutching balloons, and the scent of grilled food wafted through the space. For Angela, this wasn't just an event. It was an opportunity to connect with the people she and her department served. As Angela greeted residents, answering their questions and listening to their concerns, a young boy cautiously approached her. He couldn't have been older than 10, his wide eyes filled with both curiosity and uncertainty. He clutched the hem of his mother's jacket tightly as she nudged him forward. "Are you the police chief?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela crouched down to meet his gaze, her expression softening. "I am," she said gently. "What's your name?" "Jamal," he replied, still hesitant but a little braver now. Jamal looked at her intently before speaking again. "My dad says the police don't care about people like us." Angela felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. She nodded, her gaze steady and kind. "I can't change what's happened in the past," she said, "but I promise you, Jamal, we're working hard to do better. And if you ever need help, you can come to me, okay?" Jamal studied her face as if searching for the truth in her words. Slowly he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he said quietly. Angela rose, watching as Jamal returned to his mother. Moments like this reminded her why she had taken on this challenge. It wasn't just about fixing a system. It was about rebuilding trust, one person at a time. The findings from the investigation into Officer Daniel's behavior were undeniable. Years of complaints painted a damning picture: excessive force, inappropriate comments, and a blatant disregard for protocol. For too long, these issues had been ignored, swept under the rug to avoid conflict. But Angela Monroe wasn't here to maintain the status quo. At a precinct-wide meeting, Angela stood at the podium, her presence commanding the attention of every officer in the room. "The investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct is complete," she began, her voice firm and steady. "What we've uncovered is not a single mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is a pattern of misconduct that has no place in this department." The room fell silent, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. Daniel sat near the back, his jaw clenched and his fist tight against his thighs. He radiated tension, his usual bravado reduced to simmering anger. "As of today," Angela continued, "Officer Daniels' suspension is upheld and his appeal is denied. This decision is final." Gasps rippled through the room and Daniel shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "You're making me a scapegoat." Angela raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that followed his outburst. "This isn't about scapegoating, Daniels," she said sharply. "It's about accountability. Your actions have undermined the integrity of this department for years, and that stops now." Daniels glared at her, his face red with anger. He opened his mouth to respond, but Angela cut him off. "Enough," she said, her tone commanding. "You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the badge, the oath we swore, and the community we serve." The tension in the room was palpable as Daniels stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The remaining officers sat frozen, their expressions a mix of guilt, unease, and relief. For many, the moment marked a turning point, a clear signal that the department was no longer a haven for unchecked misconduct. Angela turned her attention back to the room, her tone softening slightly. "This isn't about punishing one person," she said. "It's about setting a standard. If we want the trust of our community, we need to be worthy of it. That starts here and now." She stepped away from the podium, her gaze sweeping over the officers. "If you're ready to meet that standard, I will stand with you every step of the way. But if you're not, this is not the place for you." The meeting ended in silence, the weight of Angela's words hanging over the room. Officers filed out slowly, their faces marked with contemplation. Some whispered quiet words of agreement, others avoided eye contact entirely. Angela stayed behind, standing at the podium and watching as the room emptied. Daniels was gone, but his departure was more than just an end. It was the start of something new. For the first time, the precinct felt like it was on the brink of real change. 1 year after Angela Monroe became police chief, the precinct was nearly unrecognizable. The toxic culture she had walked into was no longer dominant. Officers who couldn't adapt to her standards were gone, replaced by recruits eager to uphold values of integrity and accountability. While challenges remained, the progress was undeniable. Angela walked through the precinct at the end of another long day, her steps slow as she observed the quiet transformation that had taken root. The laughter she heard was no longer sharp or exclusionary. It was genuine, a sign of camaraderie built on mutual respect. Teams worked together more cohesively, their pride in their work palpable. The community, once skeptical, was beginning to take notice. Complaints had dropped significantly, and Angela had made it her mission to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. At neighborhood meetings, residents voiced concerns, but there was also a growing sense of trust. One such moment stuck with Angela. A young woman approached her after a meeting, her voice tentative but steady. "Chief Monroe," she said, "I didn't think the police would ever care about people like me. But I see what you're doing, and I wanted to say thank you." Angela smiled, humbled by the simple but powerful acknowledgement. "We're not perfect," she replied, "but we're working hard to get it right, and we're not stopping." Back at the precinct, Angela sat at her desk, flipping through reports. The work was relentless, but so was her determination. She glanced at the clock as the last officers filed out, their shifts over. Watching them leave, she saw pride and purpose in their strides. It was a quiet but profound reminder of how far they had come. The road ahead wasn't easy. Real change never was. But Angela knew the foundation had been laid. Entrenched attitudes take time to dismantle, and progress was fragile. Yet for the first time, she felt hopeful. Change had begun, and it was worth every challenge. Angela leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, but the steps they'd taken proved that real transformation was possible.